You know, in medicine, some rules feel like they're just carved in stone. And for decades, one of the most solid ones was this: you never give testosterone to a man with prostate cancer, period. It was considered absolutely forbidden. But what if that rule was wrong? Today, we're going to explore how science is completely rewriting a fundamental medical belief.
So, this is the big question, isn't it? For any man who survived prostate cancer but is now dealing with the really tough symptoms of low testosterone, this isn't some abstract scientific debate. It's a deeply personal question about their quality of life every single day. For the better part of a century, the idea of giving testosterone to a guy with a history of prostate cancer was just unthinkable. It was like pouring gasoline on a fire. But now, a whole wave of new evidence is challenging that core belief, suggesting the relationship is way more complex than we ever imagined.
So, where did this ironclad rule even come from? To really get why this is such a huge shift, we've got to go back, way back, to the research that set the standard of care for generations of doctors.
It all kicked off in the 1940s with the work of Dr. Charles Huggins. He found that you could actually slow the growth of advanced prostate cancer by starving the cancer cells of testosterone. This treatment, which we now call androgen deprivation therapy, was monumental. But it led to a very simple and, as we'll see, maybe an oversimplified conclusion. If taking testosterone away is good, then adding it back must be bad. And that idea became medical dogma for the next 80 years. And this quote just nails the thinking at the time. The idea was a straight line. The more testosterone you have, the faster the cancer grows. It's a simple, pretty intuitive concept, right? But what if the biological reality isn't a straight line at all?
And that question, what if it isn't a straight line, is exactly what some researchers finally started to ask. They began to poke holes in the old wisdom, and they proposed a totally new framework that could completely change how we understand this whole relationship.
First off, let's be really clear about why this matters so much. Low testosterone or testosterone deficiency is not a minor inconvenience. I mean, just look at this list. We're talking about symptoms that can be truly debilitating: chronic fatigue, brain fog, losing strength, and a huge impact on sexual function. For men who've already been through a cancer battle, these symptoms can just crush their quality of life. So finding a safe treatment is a huge priority.
Okay, so here it is, the new idea that's changing everything. It's called the saturation model. Just imagine the cancer cells have a certain number of, let's call them, docking stations for testosterone. This model says that once all those docking stations are full, or saturated, adding more testosterone doesn't really have any extra effect on growth. And here's the kicker. It seems like that saturation point is reached at very low testosterone levels.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting when you see them side by side. The old idea was a simple fuel on the fire thing, more fuel, bigger fire. But the saturation model, it proposes a ceiling effect. Think of it like watering a plant. A thirsty plant will soak up water and grow, absolutely. But once the soil is totally saturated, pouring more water on it doesn't make it grow any faster, right? The plant simply can't use it. This model suggests that maybe, just maybe, prostate cancer behaves the same way with testosterone.
Now, this is a fascinating theory, but is there any actual real-world evidence to back it up? Well, that's where we turn to a major new review of all the existing data to see what it tells us about the safety of testosterone replacement therapy in men who've had prostate cancer. So our main source here is a huge systematic review. Researchers pulled together the data from 19 different studies, which covered over 9,600 men. The goal was simple: find out what actually happened when these men were given testosterone, and they broke it down into 3 specific groups. All right, let's start with group number 1. These are men with low-risk prostate cancer who aren't getting active treatment. Instead, they're being watched very closely. We call this active surveillance. Now, you'd think this group would be at the highest risk if testosterone really was fuel for the fire. And the results were, well, they were stunning. The biggest study found that men on TRT were actually less likely to need active treatment down the road. Just look at the chart. Their risk was significantly lower. That hazard ratio of 0.66 basically means they had about a 1/3 lower chance of their cancer getting worse. This didn't just challenge the old wisdom, it turned it completely on its head.
Okay, so what about the second group? These are men who have had their prostates surgically removed. For these guys, the big worry is something called biochemical recurrence. It's a fancy term for when their PSA levels, that's a key cancer marker, start to creep back up after surgery, which suggests some cancer cells might still be hanging around. And again, the results were really striking. When you combine the data from 10 different studies, you see this dramatic difference. The recurrence rate for men getting testosterone was only 3.8%. But for men who didn't get it, that rate was 12.7%. That is more than 3 times higher. The evidence here is definitely pointing in the same direction. And finally, let's look at our third group, men who were treated with radiation therapy instead of surgery. What did the evidence show for them? For this group, the biochemical recurrence rate for men getting TRT was around 4.1%, which, by all accounts, is pretty low. Now, we have to be transparent here. The studies for this specific group didn't have control groups of men who weren't on TRT, so we can't do that direct head-to-head comparison like we did for the surgery patients. Still, that absolute number is pretty reassuring. So the evidence seems overwhelmingly positive, right? Case closed? Well, not so fast. Science is all about nuance, and before we go declaring a new rule, we have to look really carefully at the limitations of the data we actually have. And this part is absolutely critical. None of these studies, and I mean none of them, were the gold standard of medical evidence, a randomized controlled trial. They were mostly observational, meaning they just looked back at what happened to patients. This can cause some potential issues. For example, there's a big risk of selection bias. What's that? It means doctors might have, maybe without even realizing it, chosen their healthiest, lowest risk patients for TRT to begin with. We also don't have good data on very long-term survival. So while this evidence is incredibly promising, we have to admit it's not yet definitive. So where does all this leave us? We've got this decades-old rule based on a simple model. Then we've got a growing pile of evidence that contradicts it, but that evidence has its own flaws. The takeaway here isn't to just throw out the old rule. It's to create a new, smarter, more nuanced approach. The modern approach is what you might call a cautious green light, and it's guided by these 4 key principles. 1. Careful patient selection is everything. It is not for everyone. 2. The focus is really on men with lower risk disease. 3. Doctors have to keep a close eye on PSA levels to make sure they stay stable. And finally, number 4, diligent ongoing monitoring is an absolute must. This isn't a blanket approval. It's personalized medicine at its best, based on a careful look at risk. And this quote from the review's conclusion just sums it all up perfectly. The evidence supports cautious use in specific patients, those with favorable localized disease. It's a very careful, measured step forward, guided by the data we have, but also respectful of what we still don't know. So we end up right back where we started, but with a totally new perspective. The story of testosterone and prostate cancer is just this perfect example of how medicine evolves. And it leaves us with this really fascinating question. Could a therapy that was once so feared actually become a vital tool for helping prostate cancer survivors reclaim their quality of life? Based on the evidence we have today, the answer seems to be a cautious but an increasingly confident yes.